Welcome to part 4 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at Congressional Reconstruction. By 1867, the radical Republicans in both houses of Congress had really had it with Andrew Johnson and began taking a very aggressive stance over trying to take control over Reconstruction. They began in March of 1867 with the passage of the first of several military Reconstruction acts, right? The first Military Reconstruction Act is going to divide the South into 5 military districts, right? Each one under an appointed governor, right? It's going to adopt stricter requirements to be met before the states can be readmitted into the Union, including the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments. It established voting rights for African Americans and disenfranchised former Confederate leaders and Army officers, saying you cannot be involved in the political process, right? As a result of this, 700,000 African Americans are going to register to vote, along with 627,000 Southern whites who formed an interracial coalition in the core of the Southern Republican Party, right? Conventions met to write new constitutions in the South, right? By 1868, 7 former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union under Congressional Reconstruction rules, right? And the 14th Amendment had been ratified. Additionally, they had also introduced another amendment, the 15th Amendment. Again, Reconstruction Acts maybe had given suffrage to African Americans, but like with the idea of citizenship, how do you make sure that that is permanent, that some other legislature down the road doesn't try and overturn it, make it a constitutional amendment? The 15th Amendment states that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? This is going to have a profound effect, not only on African Americans, but also on the women's suffragist movement. Many of them were actually quite upset by this. It's like, how is it that you're going to give suffrage to African American men, because that's what this applies to in this case, but not to African American women? Matter of fact, Susan B. Anthony is going to use the 15th Amendment as justification for one of many times she'll try this. She'll register to vote in the state of New York and vote in the 1868 presidential election, stating that the 15th Amendment says that me as a citizen, which I am, cannot be denied the right to vote, right? Of course, we're going to have another constitutional amendment to make that fully apply to women and have actual true women's suffrage. We'll get there. Finally, they also passed in 1870 what would be called one of several force acts, and these were to counter groups that were rising during Congressional Reconstruction, like the Ku Klux Klan, right? And there was a whole bunch of them. The Ku Klux Klan, of course, is the most famous and the most well-known, right? These were all organizations that were designed to try and suppress African American freedom, since Congressional Reconstruction was making it where they couldn't do it through black codes or other ways that they had been doing under presidential Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan had formed at the end of the Civil War, but it didn't really have its first surge of prominence until Congressional Reconstruction. Next, Congress had the issue of Andrew Johnson himself. Like I said, he was constantly upsetting them, and he really can't get out of his own way, right? Johnson is going to continue to resist these moves by Congress and Congress's attempt to control Reconstruction. As I mentioned before, he's going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau Act of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but he's going to go further with this and continue to upset the radicals. First Military Reconstruction Act, vetoed, overturned. Second Military Reconstruction Act, vetoed, overturned. Third Military Reconstruction Act, vetoed, overturned. Just keeps going and going and going. Congress is going to try and temper the power of the presidency even by passing on March 2nd, 1867, a law called the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act was specifically designed to protect the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton was a holdover from the Lincoln administration, as was most of Johnson's cabinet, and Edwin Stanton was also a radical Republican and a real thorn in the side to Andrew Johnson. He really wanted to get rid of him, okay? The Tenure of Office Act, however, made this impossible, Okay, the act stated that any person who holds any civil office to which has been appointed by, with the advice and consent of the Senate, could only be subject to removal by the advice and consent of the Senate. In other words, cabinet appointments into the presidential staff, like Secretary of War, Secretary of State, etc., had to be done with the consent of the Senate. That's still true today. And what the Tenure of Office Act says is he can't fire him without the Senate's okay as well, right? Something that doesn't exist today, right? This means that Edwin Stanton cannot get fired, right? This really infuriates Andrew Johnson, all right? So what does Andrew Johnson do? Well, he tries at first to work around the laws in place. On August 12, 1867, Congress went into recess, and on that day, Johnson didn't fire Edwin Stanton. He suspended him. And he asked General Ulysses S. Grant to serve as acting Secretary of War in his place, right? Well, on January 13, 1868, Congress came back into session and refused to ratify the suspension and demanded that Edwin Stanton immediately be reinstated. And Grant, very wisely, immediately resigned from this temporary post. Okay, so Stanton is back in the War Department. On February 21st, Johnson finally takes the formal step, and he formally dismisses Stanton in spite of Congress's refusal to accept his removal. So, has Johnson now broken the law? Well, yes, he has. He has violated the Tenure of Office Act. So immediately Congress begins to put together articles of impeachment. The effort is going to be to impeach Andrew Johnson, convict him, and remove him from office. Okay. And 11 articles of impeachment will be issued against Andrew Johnson. Most of them have to do with the Tenure of Office Act and his violation of it. Some of them are a little bit silly, though. For example, Article 10 states that, that said Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, did attempt to bring into disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach the Congress of the United States, and made and delivered with a loud voice certain intemperate, inflammatory, scandalous harangues, and therein uttered loud threats and bitter menaces as well against Congress. In other words, he spoke too loudly at us, right? This is how just absolutely over the top this hatred between Johnson and Congress has become. Okay, the vote for impeachment will take place on the 24th of February, 1868, and the House will find him guilty and impeach him by a vote of 126 to 47. But remember, impeachment does not mean guilty of a crime. An impeachment is the same as a grand jury. It just means that a crime has been committed. We believe a crime has been committed, and it now goes to the Senate for a trial. And here's where actual guilt and innocent, as far as crime itself, is taken care of. Okay. So the Senate takes up the criminal trial of the president. The trial begins on March 5th, 1868. It's going to last until May 16th, 1868, and it's going to come down to just one vote. You need to have a 2/3 of the majority to convict. 35 will vote to convict. 19 to acquit. That's one vote shy from the 2/3 needed for a conviction. Andrew Johnson is going to escape impeachment, or excuse me, not impeachment, conviction by a single vote. He'll be one of only 3 presidents ever to be impeached. The other 2 being Bill Clinton and our current president, Donald Trump, right? But he's the one that's come closest to being convicted and kicked out of office, which would have at that time created a secession crisis, because who was Johnson's vice president? He didn't have one. Remember, he was the vice president. So it would have been quite interesting to see, because unlike, today we have more of a line of secession. Back then it was president, vice president, and then Congress will figure it out. Would have been interesting to see had that vote gone the other way, but it didn't. So Johnson's going to kind of get the message and quietly ride out the rest of his presidency after his near conviction, and he'll be replaced on March 4th, 1869 with President Ulysses S. Grant, and we'll talk about him in a separate lecture. the one thing's for certain is interest in Reconstruction in the South is going to wane. Northerners are going to get just tired of the expense and the violence involved in enforcing this forced equality, right, as it effectively was there in the South, right? And so you're going to start seeing violence break out and the North just not want to get involved anymore. For example, in 1874, the Republican governor of Mississippi, Adelbert Ames, is going to petition Ulysses S. Grant to send federal troops to help his embattled government, which was under assault by Southern Democrats who were trying to overthrow the Republican rule. That year, Grant will send federal troops to Vicksburg. In 1875, violence will break out again, and Grant will refuse. He'll say the whole public are tired out of these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South and are ready now to condemn any interference on the part of the government, right? And so now Adelbert Ames is kind of left out in the lurch as a result, right? In Louisiana in 1873, you'll have violence that's going to begin with the formation of a group called the White League. The 1872 election was contested. It was a very close election, and the Republicans won it, but you're going to have these groups of, white supremacists in the South that are going to contest the election. They'll form a group called the White League, right? Meanwhile, you're going to have a militia of mostly African Americans formed to protect the embattled government in a place called Colfax, right? On April 13th, 1873, the hotly contested election will explode into violence in what's known as the Colfax Massacre, right? On that day in April, the White League forcibly attacked the all-black militia at Grant Parish Government Building in Colfax and massacred around 150 African Americans in the process. This was Easter Sunday, right? Several of the ringleaders of the White League will be rounded up, including William Cruikshank, and he will be convicted for violating these men's 14th Amendment rights, which was unfortunate that they convicted him for a constitutional violation, because that will ultimately be overturned in the United States versus Cruikshank, in which it will be determined that an individual cannot violate someone's constitutional rights. Only the constitutional amendments only apply to the government, not individual people, right? Kind of a strange way to look at it, but that is what it is. And then also the last little straw that starts breaking the camel's back as far as Reconstruction goes, in 1873 there was an economic downturn. How do you justify the expense of maintaining these military zones in the South when the entire nation is in an economic downturn? So if Reconstruction wasn't over there by 1875, the election of 1876 put the final death nail in it, right? It was a very close election. The Republican was Rutherford B. Hayes, right? And the Democrat was Samuel J. Tilden. Grant's retiring. Both men are running because they're seen as honest men, and that's because of all the scandals that happened during the Grant administration, which we'll talk about later, okay? At the end of election night, you need 185 electoral votes to win, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, has 184. He's one short. He just needs one more. Hayes needs to win all of the remaining outstanding electoral votes, all 19 of them. The 19 remaining electoral votes are in the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. The last three southern states still under Republican control just happen to be Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And the three states are going to ratify their electoral votes for Rutherford B. Hayes, causing all kinds of controversy. It's going to push it to the courts, a disputed election. Samuel Tilden's won the popular vote by a pretty wide margin. He needs one electoral vote. He just needs one of these electoral votes that are here, right? So a commission will actually be set up with 15 members of Congress and the Supreme Court to determine where these electoral votes actually get to go. And it's supposed to be a bipartisan breakdown of 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and a nonpartisan member of the Supreme Court, who unfortunately backed out at the last minute and was replaced by a Republican-leaning member of the Supreme Court. So, 2 days before the inauguration, we still don't know who the president's going to be. These guys are going to finally vote. March 2nd, they finally vote, and it comes down for Hayes. But part of this is because a deal had already been struck. The controversy over this election had people already talking about secession again. And other people are going, didn't we just try this already? That didn't work out so well, right? So Republicans and Democrats met in Washington, D.C. on February 26, just a week before that vote by that commission, at the Wormley Hotel. And they hammered out a deal. The Democrats said, look, this is what we'll do. We will recognize Rutherford B. Hayes as the winner. We won't dispute the commission's vote because we already know how it's going to turn out. But in return, we want these things. One, we want a Democrat to be placed in his cabinet. David M. Key will be made Postmaster General. So what? Okay. Second, federal aid must be granted to help build the southern railroads, specifically the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Okay. Money to rebuild the South infrastructure. And then finally, the last federal troops need to be recalled from the South, and those military districts need to be dissolved. In other words, the South is going to take care of their race relation issues from this point forward. Reconstruction is officially over, and that idea of forced equality brought about by Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction, that's over too. Civil liberties for the freedmen in the South are going to take a tremendous, just an incredible turn for the worst after this, right? We're going to see that everything like during presidential Reconstruction, it's going to all come rolling back. And we're not going to see these returned until the 1960s, really, in a lot of ways. And the South's not going to vote for another Republican presidential candidate until the 1960s.